Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and today I'm going to be doing the Reread Book Tag. So the Reread Tag was created by Roz from Scadly Daddling About the Books, and I'll link her original video down below. I haven't been tagged in this to my knowledge, but I saw this tag on a few different channels and it looked really fun, so I thought I would do it and join in. And I like rereading, so I thought it would be nice to talk about rereading, something I haven't spoken about that much for a while. Question one is, assuming that you do reread, how much do you reread? Where do you sit on the rereading scale from almost never to all the time? I would say somewhere in the middle. I reread a bit. I don't reread massively, but I feel like there aren't many people who mostly reread. So far in 2020 I've reread 9 books, in 2019 I reread 14 books, and in 2018 I reread 19 books. So obviously that is a substantial amount of books to reread every year, but obviously I do read quite a lot of books, so that's probably like between 5 and 10% of my reading every year is rereading, which, you know, is not like a massive amount of rereading, but it's definitely like a statistically significant amount of rereading, I suppose. Question 2 is, how has that changed over your reading life? So I feel like for quite a lot of people, they reread quite a lot as a child and did so much less as an adult. I've definitely heard that said on BookTube before, but that is not really the case for me. As a child, I didn't reread at all. I don't think I did any rereading really until I was a teenager, except possibly some books that I had on audiobook, like The Secret Garden. I think I probably listened to more than once. As a teenager, I started rereading a little bit more, but most of the rereading I did as a teenager was probably when I was studying books at school that I happened to have read before, rather than like going out of my way to reread. To be honest, I think most of the rereading I've done has been in the last like 3 or 4 years. Question 3 is, when do you reread? Immediately after finishing a book, or not until later, or just when the mood strikes? Usually if I'm rereading a book, it's a book that I haven't read for years. That's not always the case, and there are some books that I reread pretty regularly, which I'll talk about a bit later, but most of the time if I'm rereading a book, it is a book that I haven't read for quite a while. I feel like the when is really tied up with the why, so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, why do you reread books? One reason, which is not a reason anymore but used to be, is if I'm studying a book, both at school and at university. If I was studying a book, I would reread it multiple times, both like it might be a book I've read before, which then I'm rereading to study it, but also especially if I was going to write on a book in an exam, I would usually read it like 3 times in preparation for exams. I remember like revising for my A-levels when I was studying Wuthering Heights, and I would just be just like rereading Wuthering Heights over and over again as my revision. So I have in the past very often reread stuff when I was studying it. Obviously don't study stuff anymore in that way, so I would say now the reasons why I reread, one is like just books that I absolutely love. I like to reread some of my favourite books ever, lots, because it's really good fun to reread a favourite book that you really love. And also I feel like, how do you know that a favourite book is still your favourite unless you've read it quite recently? So I like to reread books because of that as well. Another reason I sometimes reread books is for like readathons or reading challenges on BookTube. So for example, obviously the 2 big readathons that I run, Jane Austen in July and Victober, I very often reread something for both of them. I mean, I'm always going to be rereading something for Jane Austen July because I want to read some Jane Austen that month, and I've read all of Jane Austen before, so every Jane Austen July, like a good chunk of my reading is rereads. And then in Victober, which is my Victorian literature themed month-long readathon, I usually reread at least 1 Victorian book as well. So there's a lot of Victorian literature that I really love that I read a really long time ago. A lot of my favourite Victorian novels I first read when I was a teenager, like more than 10 years ago, so it's nice to reread them, whether I have read them in the meantime or not, and then kind of rediscover them and get to know them again. I really like rereading for getting to know a book again. I like getting back into it and rediscovering why you loved it the first time. And then also, like, if I ever host a read along of anything, usually that's something I've read before, otherwise I wouldn't know to recommend it to people in a read-along setting, I suppose. Another reason I often end up rereading books is specifically to make a BookTube video about them. This is something I've done a number of times in my course of making BookTube videos. Sometimes there is a book I really want to make a video about, but I haven't read it for a while, and then I might reread it specifically to make a video about that book, so that it's more fresh in my mind. So for example, my Feminist Victorians series, I have reread some books specifically to talk about them in those those videos, and I'm planning on doing so more in the future. And then the not so hypothetical Victorian literature course video series that I started a while ago and ended up not carrying on with. I reread quite a lot of books for that, and one of the reasons, in fact, why I stopped doing it was because it was very intensive on the rereading. Question 5 is, how do you reread? Faster, slower, or just the best bits? I would say usually when I reread in a similar way to my first reading, about the same speed and all of it. Usually if I'm rereading a book, it's because I love it, so I'm rereading it cover to cover. I feel like the two exceptions would be sometimes when I've reread a book either for a specific booktube video or for like an essay or something at university or school, then I might reread a book looking out for a particular thing. So for example, my dissertation at university was all about gender in Charles Dickens, and I reread 7 Dickens novels before writing my dissertation, specifically looking at gender, and I wasn't really paying attention to much else. And then the other different way I reread is that I do reread quite a lot on audiobook. I really like listening on audiobook to a book that I've read in physical form before, especially a book that I've never listened to on audiobook before that I know really well. It's really nice to experience it in a different way. So this year I listened to an audiobook of Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. Our Mutual Friend is my favourite novel of all time, and I've read it lots and lots of times, but I'd never listened to it on audiobook before, so it was really nice to like have a new experience with that book, even though I'm really familiar with it. So I really enjoyed that, and in general I really love audiobooks for rereads, because I think because it's a slightly different form, sometimes you do pick up different things. So that's something I really enjoy when rereading as well. Who or what do you reread? More specifically, what authors or genres or individual books? So definitely a lot of classics. I would say most of my rereading tends to be of classics. There are only a handful of contemporary authors who I have reread. Diane Setfield is one of them. I have read The 13th Tale 3 times and Burman and Black twice, and I'm hoping to reread her other novel, Once Upon a River, at some point later this year, and maybe do a read long, but more on that at some point when I get around to organising it. I love Diane Setfield. She's my favourite modern author. I have reread her, but beyond Diane Setfield, there are very few modern authors who I have reread. Nearly everything that I've reread and that I reread often is classics. This is partly because, like I said earlier, I read a lot of classics as a teenager, and a lot of the classics that I read when I was like 13, 14, 15 didn't stay in my head because that was a while ago now. So I like to reread some of those books to like refresh myself with them. Also, I really love classics. A lot of my favourite books of all time are classics, and the books I want to reread the most are my favourite books of all time. You know, the books that I love most obviously are the books that I want to reread because they're the ones I want to go back to. Also, as I said, I do sometimes reread books to make booktube videos about them, and that is usually the case with classics. That's usually for some of my like dedicated classics videos, usually because my most like analytical, in-depth videos tend to be about classics, specifically about Victorian literature. So I have often reread Victorian books for booktube. And also I would say I love rereading Victorian literature because I nearly always find that I get more out of it on a second reading. Because I read lots of Victorian literature and I constantly am reading more Victorian literature, like with every Victorian novel I read, I get more knowledge about the Victorian period and about Victorian literature, so the next time I read like another Victorian novel, I have like even more context for understanding it. Yeah, I think the authors I've reread the most are probably Dickens, Jane Austen, the Brontes and Elizabeth Gaskell. Question 7 is there a book that you have found better when you reread it? So definitely Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This is always a good example for this. When I first read Mansfield Park, it was I think my last Jane Austen, and I just didn't find it that good. I found it a bit boring in comparison to all the rest of Jane Austen that I had read. I then studied this at university and reread it like 2 or 3 times when I was studying it, and I've then reread it several times since, and it is now my second favourite Jane Austen after Pride and Prejudice. Now it's one of my favourite books of all time, which I feel like is such a good example of how wonderful rereading can be. It took me like a second reading and more and studying at university to appreciate what an amazing character Fanny Price is, and to like fully appreciate the wonders of this novel. I love it so much, and it's so complicated and interesting. I think it's like one of the hardest Jane Austens to understand because the kind of social and historical context is so important, because it's a book about like morality in many ways, but it's also a novel about like staying true to yourself and being strong about the power of being an introvert, and also a novel about like home and finding a home for yourself and all of these things which I love. And if I had only read this once, I wouldn't have got all that out of it, and now I love it so much. So yeah, in general I would say that all of Jane Austen for me has improved on rereading. Like, I really loved Jane Austen when I read her books for the first time as a teenager, but I don't think I would have considered her one of my absolute favourite authors until I worked at the Jane Austen Centre in Bath when I was doing my masters and reread all of her books and learned much more about her life, and suddenly she went from being like an author who I really liked to being my second favourite author, possibly joint with Elizabeth Gaskell, but you know. And I think because her characters are so complicated and her wit is often so nuanced, like actually Jane Austen is one of those authors that like every time you read her works, they get better because you notice more things and they're so rich. Question 8 is, what book got worse for you on a reread? There aren't very many of these, I think. In general, for me, rereading a book is like adding richness to the experience and getting even more out of it the second time. It's not often that I reread a book and don't enjoy the rereading experience. Partly, I suppose, because the books I reread are books that I love to begin with. So if I love a book and then I reread it, I'm probably going to love it more. It's not often that I'm disappointed by a reread. However, the one book I would say that definitely got worse for me on rereading is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So I studied Dracula at school when I was doing my A-levels, and I read it like over the summer before studying it, and I would say I felt like middling about it. Like, I wasn't on Goodreads then, but it would have been like a 3-star Goodreads rating. But then I studied it and I reread it and I reread it again, and the more I read it and the more I studied it, the more I despised it. Until now, Dracula is one of my least favourite books, but like the more I read it and the more I got like completely angry with Bram Stoker's like gender stereotypes and the infuriating angelicness of Mina Harker, the more I disliked it. The final question is, what books have you reread the most times? So there are 3 books, all classics, which would be contenders for this. I'm not actually 100% certain how many times I've read all of these, because I only really started like recording my reading when I was like 22, I think, and started BookTube and went on Goodreads. So going upwards, I think my 3rd most reread book is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. This is my favourite novel of all time. It tells the story of a fortune who is due to go to a particular man who is on his way back from overseas to inherit his father's property. He is found drowned on the way back, and then the book follows what happens to that fortune afterwards, and also follows like the solving of the mystery of what happened to John Harmon. It's a wonderful book. I love it so much. Every time I reread it, I love it even more. It is my favourite novel, and it's incredible. The first time I read this, I was 14 years old, and I've been rereading it at fairly regular intervals ever since. I also did write an essay on this for my A-levels, and also did my dissertation partly on this at university, so I reread it lots of times for that as well. And then in the last like 4 or 5 years, I reread it once for my Victorian serialised read-along, which I did a few years ago, and then I also reread it this year on audiobook, as I said, and this is, yeah, a wonderful one and a real joy to reread. Then number 2, I think, would be Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I'm not completely certain how many times I've read this. I've read it at least 7 times, but I think I've probably read it more times. I think it's probably somewhere between 7 and 10. I first read Pride and Prejudice when I was 13 years old and really enjoyed it. I then read it again, I think several times when I was studying it for my A-levels when I was 16, and then I reread it again when I was working at the Jane Austen Centre in Bath when I was 21. And then in the last few years, I've reread it a lot, mostly listening to the Rosamund Pike audiobook, which I've listened to like every July for the last few years. It's one of my favourite books ever. It tells the story of the Bennet family and the elder 2 sisters' complicated romantic relationships and many other things. It is a truly amazing novel, and genuinely one that like every time I read it, I get new things out of it. I really do. But I think the book that I have read the most times is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I think I've read this 9 times, so it's just possible that I've read Pride and Prejudice more times, but I'm not certain. But I think Wuthering Heights I've read the most times. This is an amazing novel by Emily Bronte, which tells the story of a family living in a place called Wuthering Heights, where everything is very complicated and very messy. And we specifically follow the kind of adopted son of this family, Heathcliff, who is on a bit of a quest for revenge for quite a lot of this book. I adore Wuthering Heights. It's one of my favourite books of all time, and it is my most read book. So I first read Wuthering Heights when I was, I think, 14 or 15, just because I wanted to read it, and then I reread it when I was studying it for my A-levels, like Pride and Prejudice, and I reread it several times then. And then I also studied Wuthering Heights at university and read it several times then, and then I've also reread it since. So I think because I studied this at school and at university, and because I wrote exams on it both times, I've read it a lot. Our Mutual Friend, I did study it both at school and university, but I wrote like my coursework on it. I didn't have to go into an exam and write about it. Whereas Wuthering Heights, I've done so many exams on that I like just read it and reread it and reread it so that I knew it off by heart for my exams. Like genuinely, I think there was a time when I was 18 where I could have like quoted half of Wuthering Heights at you. I haven't actually read Wuthering Heights for a little while. I think it's been several years since I last read it, but I love it so much and I really like to reread it. So I think this might be one that I reread this Victober. I've got it on audiobook and the audiobook's not too long and I've never listened to it on audiobook before, so I'm really excited to listen to it. I think that'll be really effective and really atmospheric, so I might read it again this October. Every time I reread Wuthering Heights, I get something new out of it. And that's all. Those are all the questions for the Reread Book Tag. I'm going to tag a few people. I'm going to tag Marissa from Blatantly Bookish. I'm going to tag Charlotte from Coney Reads. I'm going to tag Pauline from Dancing Lawn and Claudia from the Spencer's Library. I'm going to tag Leanne Rose and Jennifer Brooks and Gemma from Read Book Gem. That's probably enough people to be getting on with. So that's all for now. Do let me know down in the comments if you reread books and what your favourite books are to reread. And that's all. Thank you very much for watching and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.